Hey everyone, today we will talk about behavioral learning theory, the second part, continuing on where we left off from Tuesday. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about instrumental conditioning, and this is also sometimes called operant conditioning. And this is looking at how consequences shape learning. This focuses on strengthening or weakening voluntary responses. So remember last class we talked about the difference between voluntary and involuntary responses. So make sure you realize that this is about voluntary responses. Now, reinforcement is one way that people do operant conditioning. Here, a reinforcer is a stimulus that increases the frequency of a response. So whenever we have something that causes a response to increase, it is a reinforcer. So this is the way it works. First, a behavior happens, and then the individual gets the reinforcer, and then in the future, that behavior will increase in frequency. So for example, if your dog sits at a command and then you give your dog a treat, next time you say sit, the dog is more likely to sit. This is how we train animals, but these same principles can be used when we're working with people, because people too respond to reinforcers. Okay, so we have positive and negative reinforcement. Now, please keep in mind, negative reinforcement is not the same thing as punishment. So positive reinforcement is the presentation of a reinforcer after a response, and this reinforcer is something positive that we like, such as praise, giving an object like a toy, doing a desired activity like playing a game, or social cues like giving a smile. So for example, imagine I gave you chocolate after you answered a question, right? If you love chocolate, then you might be more inclined to answer questions in the future. Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, is the removal of an object after a response, also to increase the frequency of the behavior. So here you're removing something that the person doesn't like. So for example, if you don't like quizzes and I cancel a quiz after a productive class discussion, then that would serve as a negative reinforcer for you, and you would probably want to have more productive class discussions with the hopes that I would cancel more quizzes. Okay, in contrast to reinforcement is punishment. Punishment is where a consequence following a behavior suppresses the frequency of an undesired behavior. And there are two forms of punishment. There's the presentation of an aversive stimulus, which is called type 1 punishment, or the removal of a desired stimulus, which is called type 2 punishment. So an example of type 1 punishment is a verbal reprimand. So for example, imagine I told you to bring your book to class and you forgot it, and I scolded you. That verbal reprimand would serve as a presentation punishment, and then the next time I asked you to bring your book to class, you'd be more careful to try to remember it. Punishment, a type 2 example is, imagine you have some candy that you're eating and you keep interrupting your classmates, so I take your candy away. That here I'm removing something that you want, which is a type 2 punishment. Okay, so let's practice some of these. Punishment or reinforcement, negative reinforcement, because people get these confused. Okay, so let's try the first example. After hitting his brother, his father puts James in time out. Is that negative reinforcement or is that punishment? Well, here we can see the father's trying to decrease the behavior, so it's a punishment, and it's a removal punishment because James is removed from the situation and put in timeout. So I would say that's a type 2 punishment. For each student who gets 100 on a test, the teacher cancels the homework assignment. Here we have negative reinforcement, taking away something that's not desired to increase a behavior. Okay, number 3. After volunteering to take care of his sister, Juan's mother tells him he doesn't have to do his other chores. Here, that's again a negative reinforcement, taking away something he doesn't want to do in order to reinforce a good behavior. After Sylvia shoplifts gum from a store, her father makes her pay for the gum and write an apology to the store manager. Well, here this would be a punishment, and it would be a type 1 punishment. After failing to complete her seat work, Jalicia's teacher cancels her recess so she can complete the work. Here we have a punishment, and it's a type 2 punishment, taking away something desired. Okay, so there are effective and ineffective forms of punishment. The effective ones are things like verbal reprimands, restitution, overcorrection, timeouts, in-house suspension, or response cost. So for example, overcorrection is if a student is running down the hall and you make them go back to their starting place and walk slowly. That would be overcorrection. Verbal reprimand is something like a scold. Restitution is trying to pay back what someone is owed. In-house suspension is suspension in the school. Timeouts, you know what those are. Ineffective punishments are things like physical punishment, like hitting or taking food away or making somebody run laps. Psychological punishment, such as taunting or shaming somebody. Out-of-school suspension, that's not effective because usually kids would enjoy that, like being at home instead of being in the school environment and be able to play video games or something, who knows. For a lot of kids, it's not an effective punishment. Extra classwork is not an effective punishment because this gives the impression that classwork is something that you shouldn't want to do. And it creates that association between homework or classwork and being punished, which is not a good thing to create. And then missing recess. Kids need their recess, so pulling them out of recess is not a recommended punishment. Okay, so what do you do when an individual can't or won't engage in a desired behavior? Psychologists have figured out that we can shape behaviors to approximate the desired behavior until an individual can actually accomplish the desired behavior. So once the desired behavior is realized, then we try to reinforce the desired behavior instead of the steps that led up to it. So for example, if I want to do something like train my dog to roll over, maybe she wouldn't do it at first, so I'd have to reinforce her for lying down and then getting part way over, and then eventually when she's going all the way over, then I would reinforce her for just that behavior. Okay, extinction. Extinction happens when reinforcement no longer occurs after the behavior, and so the behavior goes away. So for example, if you set up a reinforcement system in your classroom but then you never use it, it's not actually going to cause the behaviors to continue. The behaviors will eventually go extinct. And usually what happens is, maybe a child knows that they would get a piece of candy if they clean their room. Usually right before extinction happens, so if they have been trying to clean it and have not been getting the candy, they would try to do something like really draw the attention to the room cleaning right before the extinction occurs, because they're sort of checking to see if that behavior is going to be reinforced again. Okay, so when you are using any of these behavioral modification techniques, reinforcement or punishment, make sure that the learners know what behavior is desired and what the consequences will be. That way they can actually work toward the reinforcement. Make sure that the reinforcements are meaningful and worth it to the learner. So for example, if you're trying to reinforce your students with stickers and they don't care about getting stickers, it's not going to work. You have to find something that is actually meaningful to the learner to use as the reinforcement. Punishment should always be logical and appropriate in scope, and you should not promise things that you wouldn't deliver. So, for example, don't threaten your kids that you're going to send them to the principal if they keep fooling around in the classroom if you're not actually willing to send them to the principal, because that just undermines you. And then you want to administer consequences consistently and predictably. Applied behavioral analysis is often used in educational settings, and it's a systematic approach to dealing with behaviors using reinforcement and punishment. And this is frequently used in special education and other therapeutic settings. So applied behavioral analysis is essentially a technique to systematically use reinforcement. And there are 7 main steps to applied behavioral analysis. The first one is identifying behaviors in observable, measurable terms, and then measuring the behaviors before and after the intervention, identifying the environmental conditions that encourage the problem behavior. So for example, I was talking with a principal yesterday, and he said, oh, he had a student who kept getting sent to the principal. And so he reviewed the student's records, and he realized that it's at the same time every day, at 1:10 every day. So he went and talked to the teacher and said, well, what happens at 1:10 every day? And the teacher said, well, that's when I teach math. And so the student's disruptive behavior was linked to that specific environmental condition, the math lesson. So that situation was encouraging the problem behavior. So now they needed to develop and implement a treatment plan to address that behavior. So try to figure out a way that that child could feel more successful and connected to math, for example. And then monitor that treatment, promote generalization, which is trying to see how that child could use those same positive strategies in other settings, and then finally phasing out the treatment once the desired behavior is attained. Okay, now for your quiz this week, you are going to need to answer the following 2 questions for each of the following scenarios. So there's 3 scenarios and 2 questions for each. Please type your responses in the correct boxes in the quiz form on BB Learn. The first question is, what behavior is currently being reinforced in the scenario and how? And the second question is, how can you change the behavior with either a reinforcement or a punishment? Okay, so scenario 1. Nadia is an 8-year-old girl who is often disruptive in class. She frequently interrupts when the teacher is talking to make jokes. Usually, when this happens, her classmates laugh and she gets a lot of attention. So I want you to come up with a behavioral intervention that will help Nadia learn to stop interrupting. So the first step is, what behavior is currently being reinforced in the scenario and how? And the second question is, how can you change the behavior with either reinforcement or punishment? Okay, scenario 2. Jenny is a 6-year-old girl who has developed a habit of stealing snacks out of her classmates' lunchboxes. Even though Jenny does not have any known food allergies, her parents have strict dietary guidelines for her that include no gluten and no processed foods. Jenny tends to favor stealing chips and cookies and often sneaks eating them in the back of the classroom when it is independent work time. So come up with a behavioral intervention that will help Jenny learn to stop stealing food. So what behavior is currently being reinforced in the scenario and how can you change this behavior with either a reinforcement or a punishment? And then finally, scenario 3. Carlos is an 8-year-old boy who has been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. He frequently wanders around the classroom during quiet time and is often disruptive to his classmates. Come up with a behavioral intervention that will help Carlos stop disrupting his peers. So again, what behavior is currently being reinforced in the scenario and how can you change this behavior with either a reinforcement or punishment? I look forward to reading your responses to these 3 scenarios, and I hope you have a good weekend. Make sure to watch all the videos linked in the module guide, and make sure to complete your signature assignment 3 by Tuesday. I'll see you then. Have a great weekend. Bye.